Let's begin quietly, because the Second Middle Passage didn't begin with ships. It didn't begin at the ocean. It began after the Atlantic slave trade was already supposed to be over. When most Americans think about slavery, they imagine chains crossing the Atlantic. They imagine ships coming from Africa. They imagine the Middle Passage, and then they imagine that once enslaved Africans were in America, the movement stopped. That is not what happened. What followed was something just as violent, just as devastating, and in many ways more intimate. Historians call it the Second Middle Passage, the forced internal migration of enslaved people within the United States, primarily between 1820 and 1860. And it uprooted about 1 million human beings. Not across an ocean, across their own country. By 1808, the United States officially outlawed the transatlantic slave trade. And Americans like to tell themselves a comforting story about that moment. They like to imagine it as a moral turning point. But the truth is, slavery didn't slow down. It reorganized. What changed was where enslaved people came from, not how much they were exploited. Instead of importing people from Africa, the slave system turned inward. Enslaved people became the supply. Their bodies, their children, their forced reproduction, and most importantly, their forced movement. To understand the Second Middle Passage, you have to understand what was happening in the Deep South. In the early 19th century, the American South was expanding aggressively westward. New states were opening: Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. At the same time, cotton became king. The invention of the cotton gin made short-staple cotton wildly profitable, but only if you had massive labor. And cotton didn't just require labor. It required fresh labor. Cotton exhausted the land quickly. Planters were constantly pushing into new territory, which meant new plantations, which meant new enslaved workers. But Africa was no longer legally available. So the system did the only thing it could do. It moved people already enslaved in the Upper South, Virginia, Maryland, Kentucky, North Carolina, and sold them south and west. This wasn't random. It was planned. It was organized. It was profitable. Here is one of the most disturbing truths of American history. By the early 1800s, the Upper South had more enslaved people than it economically needed. Tobacco was declining. Soil was depleted. Plantations were shrinking. But enslaved people were still being born. So enslavers in places like Virginia began to sell human beings as a primary product. They raised children not just to work, but to be sold. Families were intentionally broken apart because a mother and child sold separately brought more money. This is where the phrase "sold down the river" comes from. Not metaphorically, but literally. Down the Mississippi, down into harsher labor, down into deeper terror. This was not one journey. It was thousands of journeys. Some people were moved by riverboats. Others were marched hundreds of miles in chains, in groups called coffles. Men, women, and children bound together by iron collars and shackles. They slept on the ground. They were whipped for slowing down. They were fed barely enough to survive. And they were marched past towns full of white Americans who watched and accepted this as normal. This is crucial to understand. The Second Middle Passage happened in public. It happened on roads. It happened in towns. It happened in front of churches. It required the participation, or at least the silence, of tens of thousands of white citizens. We often talk about slavery in numbers, but this story is about people. People like Solomon Northup, kidnapped in New York and sold into Louisiana slavery, who described coffles of chained men and women marched south. People like John Brown, enslaved in Virginia, who watched his mother and siblings sold away one by one. People like Harriet Jacobs, who described the terror of knowing that at any moment she could be sold farther south, away from everything she knew. People like Eliza, whose story was recorded by enslaved witnesses, a mother forced to leave her children behind as she was marched west. She screamed, she begged, and she was dragged away anyway. These stories are not exceptions. They are representative. This did not happen in a vacuum. The Second Middle Passage was controlled by slave traders like Franklin and Armfield, the largest slave trading firm in U.S. history. Politicians who protected the domestic slave trade. Judges who enforced slave contracts. Bankers who financed purchases. Newspapers that advertised human beings for sale. This was not just Southern planters. This was a national economy. Northern banks financed it. Northern insurance companies insured it. Northern factories processed the cotton it produced. Slavery moved, but the profits moved everywhere. The original Middle Passage stripped people of homeland. The second Middle Passage stripped people of everything they had rebuilt: language, family, community, churches, graves of loved ones. People who had lived their entire lives in Virginia suddenly found themselves in Mississippi swamps. Different labor, different punishments, shorter life expectancy. Many enslaved people believe correctly that being sent south was a death sentence. And they resisted. They ran. They sabotaged. They revolted. They mourned. And they remembered. The Second Middle Passage is one of the most important and least taught events in American history. It explains why black families were fractured across states, why Southern black culture developed as it did, why trauma is layered across generations, why slavery was not static but violently mobile. In next part, we'll go deeper into daily life during forced marches, children born during the migration, women's specific experiences, resistance and survival strategies, and how this movement reshaped the Deep South forever. Up to now, we've stayed with the enslaved. We've walked the roads. We've felt the chains. We've listened to the silence and the screams. Now we have to turn the camera around, because the Second Middle Passage didn't happen because of the times. It didn't happen because of vague prejudice. It happened because specific people built and managed it. This was not chaos. This was a business. By the 1820s, the buying and selling of enslaved people within the United States had become one of the most profitable industries in the nation. There were professional slave traders, purpose-built slave pens, financing networks, shipping routes, insurance policies, legal contracts. This wasn't informal neighbor-to-neighbor selling. It was a vertically integrated market. And at the top of that market were firms like Franklin and Armfield. If you want to understand the Second Middle Passage, you need to understand Isaac Franklin and John Armfield. These two men ran the most powerful slave trading operation America had ever seen. Their headquarters was in Alexandria, Virginia, right near Washington, D.C. From there, they purchased enslaved people in the Upper South, held them in large slave pens, transported them by ship and coffle to New Orleans, sold them at enormous profit. They owned ships specifically designed to transport human beings. They had agents across states. They advertised openly. They were not criminals. They were respected businessmen. Here's how the system worked. The first step was purchase. Traders bought enslaved people cheaply in Virginia or Maryland, where supply exceeded local demand. The second reason is containment. They held people in pens, sometimes for weeks, until enough bodies were gathered for transport. People were marched or shipped south. Losses were calculated into the business model. Sale. In New Orleans or Natchez, the same person could sell for 2 to 3 times the purchase price. A single successful trip could make a trader rich. This is why the system expanded. Slave traders didn't operate alone. They were protected by state governments, federal courts, police forces, militias, the U.S. Constitution itself. When enslaved people escaped, federal marshals could be called. When traders were challenged, courts enforced contracts. When abolitionists interfered, they were prosecuted. The Second Middle Passage was not tolerated by the state. It was defended. Many Southern politicians were directly invested in slavery. Some owned enslaved people. Some financed plantations. Some profited indirectly through land speculation. And many Northern politicians, while publicly condemning slavery, protected the domestic slave trade because it stabilized the national economy. Cotton exports fueled American wealth. Slavery paid federal taxes. Everyone knew this. You'll often hear the myth that the worst brutality came from a few bad traders. This is false. The violence of the Second Middle Passage was not an exception. It was structural. Even traders who considered themselves humane still chained people, separated families, sold children, profited from suffering. The system did not allow kindness, only efficiency. Enslaved people knew who was responsible. This matters. Enslaved people didn't see slavery as abstract. They named names. They remembered traders, overseers, and buyers. They distinguished between plantation owners, traders, guards, auctioneers. This is why resistance often targeted movement itself. If you could avoid being sold south, you might survive. If you couldn't, everything changed. Why the system intensified after 1830. As cotton expanded, the demand for labor exploded. At the same time, enslaved populations in the Upper South continued to grow. Land in the Deep South continued to open. The value of enslaved people skyrocketed. By the 1850s, enslaved people were the single largest financial asset in the United States, worth more than all factories, all railroads, all banks combined. This is not a moral footnote. It is the economic core of the nation at the time. The human cost was the point. The Second Middle Passage worked because it destroyed stability. It prevented community formation, undermined resistance, kept enslaved people in constant fear, turned families into liabilities. The cruelty wasn't accidental. It was useful. By now, one thing should be clear. The Second Middle Passage was not just a tragedy endured by enslaved people. It was a strategy deployed by power. If the Second Middle Passage was about destruction, then this part is about what came after destruction. Because even after chains, marches, auctions, and forced relocation, enslaved people did something the system never planned for. They remembered. They adapted. They rebuilt culture under pressure. And that rebuilding permanently reshaped the Deep South. Trauma that didn't end at arrival. For many enslaved people, the trauma of forced migration didn't stop when the march ended. It followed them into new plantations, new labor regimes, new punishments, new social hierarchies. People carried grief that had nowhere to go. Grief for parents left behind, children sold away, partners never seen again, communities erased overnight. But enslaved people were not allowed to mourn openly. So grief went underground. It lived in memory, ritual, silence, and song. How memory was preserved without writing. Most enslaved people were denied literacy. So memory survived in other ways. Through oral storytelling, spirituals, proverbs, naming practices, burial customs, religious expression. Older enslaved people told younger ones where they came from. Not just Africa, but Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas. This is why generations later, people in Mississippi or Louisiana would still say, "My people came from Virginia." That wasn't nostalgia. That was history being preserved by mouth. Language and accent shifts. The forced mixing of enslaved populations from different regions created new dialects. People from Tidewater, Virginia, Low Country, South Carolina, Upper North Carolina, were suddenly working side by side. Over time, accents blended, vocabulary shifted. African linguistic patterns collided with English in new ways. This is one of the reasons Southern Black English developed differently from region to region. The Second Middle Passage reshaped language. Religion changed under pressure. Religion was one of the few spaces where enslaved people could process trauma collectively. But religion changed too. Older enslaved people brought spiritual traditions from the Upper South, already shaped by earlier African influences. In the Deep South, those traditions merged with new labor schedules, new surveillance, new punishments. Secret prayer meetings increased. Spirituals took on layered meanings. Songs about crossing rivers or traveling roads weren't just about heaven. They were about movement, loss, and survival. When someone sang, "I'm bound for the promised land," everyone listening knew what that really meant. Family structures after separation. The Second Middle Passage shattered biological families, but enslaved people created chosen families. People adopted orphan children, took on aunt and uncle roles, formed kinship bonds based on survival, not blood. This wasn't accidental. It was resistance. A way of saying, you can move us, but you cannot erase care. This tradition of extended family and community responsibility didn't disappear after emancipation. It carried forward. The psychological weight of being sold south. Even for enslaved people who weren't moved, the threat of the Second Middle Passage shaped daily life. Sold south became a terror phrase. A punishment worse than whipping, worse than hunger. Parents disciplined children harshly, not out of cruelty but fear. Don't let them notice you. Don't draw attention. Don't give them a reason to sell you. This constant fear reshaped behavior. Quiet became a survival tactic. Compliance became strategic. Resistance became subtle. Music as survival technology. Music wasn't just expression. It was communication. Songs marked time, carried warnings, offered coded hope, allowed emotional release without punishment. Rhythms helped people work through exhaustion. Call and response reinforced community. This musical structure, born of trauma, would later influence blues, gospel, jazz, soul. American music carries the imprint of the second Middle Passage, whether it acknowledges it or not. Naming the dead without graves. Many enslaved people who died during forced migration were never properly buried. No markers, no records. So memory became the grave. People remember names. They told stories. They kept lineage alive in fragments. This is why genealogical gaps are so painful for descendants today. Those gaps weren't accidental. They were produced. Why this history was later erased. After emancipation, America rushed to forget. The Civil War became about states' rights. Slavery became abstract. The domestic slave trade vanished from textbooks. Why? Because acknowledging the Second Middle Passage meant acknowledging that slavery expanded after 1808, that the nation profited enormously, that brutality was not confined to ships, that the violence was internal and national. Forgetting was convenient. For survivors, forgetting was impossible. The Second Middle Passage did not just move bodies. It moved culture, memory, trauma, creativity, resistance. It forged the Deep South as we know it. By the time the Civil War begins in 1861, the Second Middle Passage has already done its work. 1 million people have been uprooted. Entire regions have been transformed. The Deep South has been remade into a cotton empire powered by forced migration. And yet, this story is almost never told as a migration story. So, in this final part, we're going to talk about how it ended, what didn't end, and why the legacy of the Second Middle Passage is still with us. Emancipation did not undo the damage. When people hear emancipation, there's a tendency to imagine a clean break. Chains off. Freedom granted. History resolved. That is not how it worked. When slavery legally ended, formerly enslaved people were landless, dispersed, often far from any surviving family, economically trapped in the same regions they were forced into. The Second Middle Passage meant that millions of Black Americans entered freedom already displaced. They were free, but stranded. Searching for family after slavery. After emancipation, one of the first things formerly enslaved people did was search. They placed ads in newspapers. They traveled by foot, wagon, rail, if they could afford it. They asked strangers questions. Do you know my mother? Do you know my brother? Do you know where the people from Orange County, Virginia, went? Most searches failed. Not because people didn't care, but because the records had been destroyed, hidden, or never kept. The Second Middle Passage didn't just separate families. It made reunions statistically unlikely. Why sharecropping replaced slavery so easily? The Deep South needed labor. Planters needed control. And formerly enslaved people had nowhere else to go. Sharecropping stepped neatly into slavery's place. It tied people to land they didn't own. It kept them in debt. It restricted movement. And because the Second Middle Passage had already concentrated Black populations in cotton regions, the system worked efficiently. Freedom came, but movement was still controlled. Trauma passed through generations. The Second Middle Passage didn't end in 1865. It became inherited memory. Children grew up hearing fragments. Your people came from Virginia. Don't trust contracts. Don't let them separate us. These weren't superstitions. They were survival lessons passed down. This is why modern discussions about displacement, migration, and Black geography in America cannot be separated from slavery's internal movements. Why this history was buried. There's a reason you didn't learn this in school. Teaching the Second Middle Passage requires admitting slavery expanded internally. The U.S. economy depended on forced migration. White Americans witnessed and enabled it. The violence was not confined to ships or plantations. It disrupts the myth that slavery was a regional mistake instead of a national system. So it was minimized or ignored. Calling it the Second Middle Passage is not exaggeration. It acknowledges that forced movement didn't end in 1808. The trauma of migration was repeated. The violence was systematic. The suffering was national. Names shape memory, and memory shapes responsibility. Why this history still shapes the present. The legacy of the Second Middle Passage helps explain why black families are spread across states, why Southern black culture is so layered, why genealogical gaps are common, why migration and movement are central themes in black history, why trust in institutions is fragile. This isn't about guilt. It's about clarity. The Second Middle Passage was not an episode. It was a transformation. It turned enslaved people into commodities on the move. It turned regions into profit zones. It turned memory into resistance. And it reminds us that American history didn't just happen at borders. It happened on roads, rivers, auction blocks, and in chains inside the country itself. If we want to understand America honestly, we have to understand this. Because the people who endured it didn't disappear. They survived. They built families. They shaped culture. And their descendants are still here.